Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Sonya Ramsey. She is a professor of history in women's and gender studies and the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. She is the author of several historic works, receiving the 2023 C. Calvin Smith Wally R. Karif Book Award for African American Studies. She is a speaker and historical research consultant on themes relating to Black teachers, desegregation, African American women's history, oral history, U.S. history, women's and gender studies, and African American Greek letter sororities. I am so excited to speak to you today. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's fascinating. I always have to just commend people on their ability to have achieved so many things throughout their life. You've written many books. How has that process been like for you?
As a historian, it's been a journey. I am not, I wouldn't consider one of my like history wonder children that produce a book every 2 years. It's been a journey, but I think it's a part because I love to do interdisciplinary work. And I also do research on people who are still alive. And so that's
Mm,
complicated. You really have to work with them. I love that. You have to find records in people's basements. They're not always in an archive.
mm.
You have to get to know the person to get do different ethnographic kind of techniques you wouldn't do in history to try to get to know people. So it's a bit like almost being a journalist and a historian and a detective sometimes when you're looking for records. So it takes some time, but I definitely think the books come out when they're supposed to, and it's how it's supposed to be. And so I'm happy to be able to do these books maybe, and I'll be continuing to do more, I hope so.
That's lovely. How did you find your interest in history? I think it happens for some and it does. One thing I've found about history is that people's interest for it comes at some point in their life. But I have found so many people who hated it in school to eventually find interest as they get older. Where did you find your interest for history?
Actually, I always loved history. I always loved looking at PBS documentaries when I was little, and even like British documentaries. They're so different from my life, and I found them fascinating. And it just seemed exciting to learn about different cultures and different people, and learn about their innermost lives. Because through history. And so I always had a affinity for history. I thought of history as knowing about people and things, not memorizing dates. And so the other thing is that I wanted to be a journalist. So I had that kind of curiosity, almost steered in that direction. But when it came time to do journalism, I was thinking about print journalism. And that you really had to climb through the ranks of doing obits and, looking for a story. And some of that, I didn't really want to do that kind of intrusive nature of learning about people. I just wanted them to share their memories. And when I was decided to go to graduate school after I'd been working in public relations, and I actually was laid off. And so it was really a fascinating story because the president of the CEO of the station was one of the Rockefellers, the famous
Hmm.
Rockefellers from the Gilded Age in the 1980s. They still had money. And she had an Hermes bag. And she told me she had to lay me off because they had to keep the light bills going. I was like, if my salary is less than your bag, if I could just have that bag, we can just touch your bag. I was so fascinated with her bag. But I decided my mother, my family talked to me and said, why don't you try to do what you wanted to do in the first place and just see what happens. If it doesn't happen, you could do something else. I think younger people, some of them are so driven, they have to do this. They realize life has changes what you start off with. You might end up doing something else. So I
Mm,
landed in history. Unfortunately, that's where I stayed. So I can still delve into people's lives and find out everything about them. But then it's okay. So I don't feel like I'm chasing
hmm.
down things. I also didn't like the idea of journalism. If there's a avalanche next door, the journalists would run to the avalanche to get the story. But I don't know if I want to run to an avalanche. So, I realized I didn't have that go get them kind of thing. I do in a way,
Mm.
but not in that way where I risk my life kind of thing. But I do love history. So yes.
Mm. Because a historian doesn't need to run immediately to the place of where the action is happening because they're
Right.
kind of going backwards in time. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yes.
So, you talk a lot about your work in the intersection of feminism, of race, and of Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because I think the reason history is really important and something I've been learning on in this season is how the things that have happened in the past have really shaped way to make the situations that we're in today. And I
Yeah.
think by tracing back accurately and properly, we can actually understand why some of the things are the way they are today. So perhaps we can start with feminism, which I think would be a really great place to kind of understand how education has gone to where it is today. It's like one lens of looking at it. So, when you talk about feminism, what do you mean, first of all, by the word feminism?
Well, when I think of feminism, I it's a very complicated word because I think of it from an intersectional lens where I'm looking at the feminism of women of color, which is maybe quite different, where you have the idea of feminism where your main oppression is male, the patriarchy or male oppression. For the women that I write about and chronicle, they have many different types of oppressions. They have class oppression, racial oppression, and gender oppression, all intersecting and affecting their lives at the same time. So, in different matters and formats. So, I found that fascinating to think of feminism in that way and to look at the lives. And it was not difficult to do because it was quite apparent looking at these teachers' lives or other people I've done research on how they may have been top teachers, but they could never be a principal because they were a woman, or they may have gone went to a desegregated school, and then now they're no longer the top teacher because they're the only Black person in the school. So it was quite using that lens of feminism to understand that through an intersectional kind of format really helped me to understand things and kind of expand our ideas of what feminism is. I think feminism as a word has been kind of co-opted by people who don't support those ideas to kind of think of as women who hate men or women who want to dominate men. And that's never what feminism has been about. It's about women having the right to be themselves, to empower themselves, to make choices in their lives. And it's just kind of simple. And so I wanted to kind of convey that into my research and work as well, and in my teaching as well. And so, and then when I branched into women and gender studies, I learned so much more about different aspects of feminism, and interacting with violence, interacting with education and things. And in the whole history of teaching, where it once was the predominant area of men, and then it becomes feminized. And when it becomes feminized, they think that you can pay teachers less. And so you see the inequities within that, even on to today. The feminization of teaching, thinking that it's only women can teach, when originally it was always men that were the teachers in certain ways. So looking at how societal changes about constructions, about gender and race, and looking at how feminism has had to interact with that. And then also looking at the way that you can be a feminist in a part of a oppressed group and still oppress another group. So looking at those interactions among women is fascinating to me as well, too. So.
Hmm. I think you brought up a really interesting point, and perhaps we can start there. So that transition of the feminization of teaching, what was the history behind that?
Well, at first, men were the teachers, but as men began to get more opportunities, as the United States industrializes, you see the rise of corporations and businesses, more men were able to get jobs in that arena. And you see a shortage of teachers as the schools are expanding across the country. So Catherine Beecher Stowe, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, she really pushes forward that women were a natural go-to for teaching, even though it was a time where white women were not really thought of to work outside in the home as having quote careers. The really only jobs you could get maybe was a nurse or a governess. But most women worked in their job was working in the home. So teaching gave opportunities for women who did not have who needed that outlet for their income and their actually to get a job, a quote respectable job as a teacher. So you see how it becomes more ideas. You could hire teachers for less money, women for less money. They were always paid less, and then they could teach. And they also would add this idea of mothering. You mother the students could be brought upon the teacher. So it really shifted this idea. Now the teacher is a type of form of a mother in a way, mothering the students.
Hmm.
And so you have teachers, women teachers. They were still always male teachers, of course, but women start to dominate the profession probably by the time we get to the turn of the century. You think of the teacher, you think of the women's teacher, but there still were always men. But the hierarchy, the principals, administrators were predominantly still males. So
Hmm. And so this is around 1900s, correct?
around 1870, after the Civil War. You see, so 1900s, 20s, people are the cities, people are moving to the cities. They're getting all these new jobs and these new businesses and corporations. And it really did a drastic change around that period. And so many new things were opening up for men to do. And it became more lucrative to have these jobs and have a teaching job. So there still were men teachers, of course. It's just the doors opened up for more women to become teachers, which was quite radical because it did give them jobs outside of the home, and they could keep their jobs. It wasn't till now. Sometimes in some areas they had to quit when they got married, but some places they didn't. But at least for a while they had their own careers. So.
Mm. What about if we were to speak about the actual access to education itself, as opposed to from the teaching perspective? In the American context, what has been the brief history of how women's access to education has changed from the starting maybe from the 1800s?
Well, at first, it was difficult for women, especially white women, to have access to education. It was thought that a woman of a higher economic standard could have a governess where you learned how to read and write, play the pen,
Mm.
play an instrument, needlepoint. But beyond that, there was no real reason for a woman to have an education. And also, if you were not of a high economic standard, there really was no reason for you to have an education at all. And so it was very difficult. There was a brief moment where some women were getting into college, but then that starts to shut down. As we get to around the turn of the century and this whole idea of professionalization of schools, they start barring women from schools. And actually it was not a positive. And so there used to be a series many years ago called Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. And she was one of the few women that was able to attend medical school and become a doctor. But that door would close after her a little bit. So it would
What
not.
time is this?
Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman was a fictional character set probably in the late 1880s, 1890s, and
Okay.
something like that. I believe so. And then now, but they wouldn't open back up to the 1970s, really, for women to get into
Wow.
elite medical schools and things. So they had quotas, maybe they let one in or things. So it was really the prevailing thought was that there's no point to provide educational access for women in higher education, especially graduate schools, medical schools, professional schools, because they are really taking a spot for a man, because all these women are going to do is get this education and get married and waste the whole thing, just waste it.
Mm.
So, and that was a prevailing thought for many, many, well into the 20th century. So they could go to undergraduate schools. Some schools were co-ed, many were not. They had separate women's colleges, and they could attend, but the primary goal there was you go there, but you also go there to find a husband, right? So then if you didn't finish, that's okay if you got engaged. So that was very gendered and very restrictive. But for African American women, it was quite different because their schools were created after during Reconstruction to educate teachers. And it was thought that you should educate women so they won't have to go into domestic service and face possible sexual harassment working in white men's homes. And that was the thing. You pushed girls towards education because boys often had to work in the fields in agriculture and they needed them more. So
Mm.
that you see a predominance of women in higher education more so than men. Now they still had a hierarchy where men were the top administrators and college leaders and things, but you've always been co-ed for African American women to attend school. So, and because that was the way of propelling that entire family to the middle class, if she could become a teacher, right? So they've not been boundaries there as much as it was for white women, which is interesting. So.
Mm. And so what have you found to be some of the long-standing impacts of this barring to education in the early 1900s? What are some of the trickle-down effects of that?
Well, it really did limit women's access to education. It really limited their access to higher education. We don't know the untold scientists and doctors and lawyers we would have had if women had access to education. And it also promoted this, and it was also prevailing thought that if a woman had too much access to education, it would be detrimental to her mental health. There was too much learning would be hard for her to, she would not be, it may even ruin her reproductive organs and things. So there were so many negative stereotypes towards women's education that they had to dispel. But what's fascinating is with spiraling forward decade and decade with affirmative action, women have been the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action, and they've really dispelled that idea. No one thinks twice about a woman surgeon now, but for a while they were like, "Oh, a woman surgeon, I don't know." So they really kind of surpassed that gender stereotype in a way. So and it's very fascinating. So much in that they don't think there was a stereotype in the beginning. So it's interesting. It's interesting, but you see barriers still in certain ways with women, maybe in very, very higher college presidents, but they're breaking those barriers now too as well. So
Yeah. I mean, I know that most universities now have a higher percentage of women than men, significantly.
yes, yes.
Um, and so, I think one thing that you mentioned that I thought was interesting is that sometimes, and I think this is a power of history, you can forget that the world 100 years ago, 200 years ago looked very different than it does today. I mean, I forget that all the time. It's funny, I was recently watching the Hunger Games very randomly, but one of the things that they had said in it is that right after a really large war or a lot of like human suffering, there's a small period of time where people remember and say, let's not go back there. But
Right. Never
then
again.
yeah, and then as time moves forward and forward and forward, as it seems like we're doing right now, where the kids, I grew up not knowing anything about the Cold War or about World War II and not even hearing about those things. So I've always grown up in a world where, and I haven't had to really process that large level of human suffering. And so I feel that we start making decisions that kind of ignore that is something
Mhm.
that's happened very recently. And so one thing I'm curious about is when we talk about segregation, I think that's something that I can't really even imagine being a world where they're like, all right, all brown and black people go to school here. All, I mean, to see something like that would be something that I can't really imagine at this point. And so I'm curious to understand the history of segregation of schooling and to get kind of a brief understanding into that.
Oh, sure. It's a broad topic. So if we start right during the Reconstruction era, one of the things, and that's the period right after the Civil War, right? So one
Okay.
of the things that African Americans wanted, they're free now, and they really wanted to participate in the American fabric. They weren't like, let me get away. They were like, we're citizens. Let's vote. Let's get land. Let's do this. One of the things they wanted was to have the free common, the public school. Now, that
Mm,
was a concept that had really started in the 1830s. With this idea of educating the new Irish immigrants to be quite Americanize them, right? Socialize them. School wasn't just a place to learn, it was a place to socialize. So the idea never really took in the South. They didn't have as much immigration, but African Americans wanted that because they wanted access to education. Because prior to that, during enslavement, they were barred from learning things. It was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read. So they really wanted it. And so they push for this free public education. But as they are free, but they're not free from racism, it's still white supremacy in the society. So the schools were set up separately. First, the predominantly white teachers were teaching in the Black schools, and African Americans wanted Black teachers in the Black schools because they did not think that the white teachers would really want to teach their kids. So that's right very soon. But after that, you see the entrenchment of Jim Crow segregation laws where it becomes legalized to keep the blacks and whites separate. And so you start to see these black schools and white schools where black schools are sorely underfunded. There wasn't a big impetus to educate African Americans because in some places in the South and even in the North, they were a majority and they were fear of what would happen. And then also they thought if they're going to be relegated to menial, to agricultural jobs, work, they don't need to learn Greek and Latin and calculus, do they? And so, what would that do? You might make them want to think too much and act up their equal. So there's always been a limit on their education. So African Americans have been pushing to get past this limit. So segregation takes effect in the South legally, but in the North, it was custom. Actually, schools are segregated today. So we don't see it. You can still go to where you want, but if you look at the schools, they're primarily segregated in most of the country. It's resegregated, actually. Some of that is because of the neighborhoods people live in are segregated. So that's where they send their kids. Some of it is because of policy of where they decide to put schools. City planners working with area businesses where we want to put a school here, and there's certainly only a certain group that lives there. Federal policies over the years, like FHA loans, would only grant loans in segregated areas. Banks would only grant loans to homes to buy in segregated areas. So all of this has worked the bill. It's not just the schools; it was the city governments, state governments, federal governments, economic businesses. All helped to reinforce segregated. They even had things called what's called a restrictive covenants. So you couldn't buy a house in a neighborhood you wanted if they didn't rent to African Americans or Mexicans or Jewish people. So certain Asian groups couldn't buy homes in certain areas. So all of this leads to the schools because they have children and they go to school. So they
Hmm.
reinforce segregation. So it was a monumental thing in 1954 to get that from the Supreme Court ruling to say that was illegal. It has been so entrenched in society. Although people really didn't desegregate till the late 1960s, it was a landmark case because it had to prove that this kind of practice was inherently unconstitutional, and it had been in operation for decades. So that is how it got started. People may naturally want to congregate in similar groups, but study after study have shown that people learn, they increase their knowledge from learning from different groups, and having not just the same people that look like you and think like you and act like you all the time. And so I think some of this is based in fear, some of this is based in some racism, some sexism, some of the isms, but we are still pushing through on that. I think it's even having backlashes as we take steps forward in that. But we still want to ensure that everyone has opportunity to education. And some of that has been now affected, not just by race, by social class, of course, where you live, if your family can pay taxes, if your family can speak English. A lot of these things come into factors now that we're still dealing with, but we can look back in history and see why that wasn't working and why we need to fix it. But I think some people are kind of stuck in their own mindset. I also think some people are thinking, I need to get this for my kid. And I don't care about the other kids. So the idea of school for the public good has been hit a little bit. I think it's been
Hmm.
we need to do this for the public good. Now it's like, what can my kid get? Forget those other poor kids. I don't forget those poor kids. What can my kid get? And I know people want to take care of their own children, but this idea of the public good has been a strength in America. That's why we had public schools in the first place. Other countries didn't have access to free public schools. So I think we want to maintain that to maintain a democracy, I hope. So, and that's what even the founding fathers argued, you have to have access to free education to have a democracy, right? So
Yeah,
people won't
for sure.
fall sway to things. But I think that it is unfortunate, this attitude about, I've got to get my kid, but forget the rest of these kids. You know what I mean? It's
Mm,
really kind of pervaded society a bit now. So
yeah, no, definitely. And I've noticed that a lot even in policy school where amount of conversations that we would have these lofty goals and ideals, but in our day to day, everyone was still like, all right, well, it's all for me, right? I mean, how could we speak on, doing work for the community, doing work for others while still being like, all right, well, I'm not going to help people in my day to day. It's a
right.
quite a fascinating thing. One thing I was curious about that you were mentioning there is Bell Hooks talks about this of how she was growing up in the generation where the desegregation was happening as she was part of that generation that had to experience that change. What do you think were some of the narrations of what was their experience like having to actually change that? Because I know she was explaining that her experience of schooling changed drastically after going to a desegregated school where the teachers no longer felt like they cared about her. She had like a poorer experience. And I know even on the previous episode when I was speaking with Dr. Catherine Bell, she was talking about how different her experience was going to a PWI university versus the HBCU. And so I'm curious, what are some of the stories that we've learned of the generation that had to go through that change?
And there were several generations because she didn't, and I did, and younger, so it lasted 20 or 30 years. So one thing about attending the desegregated school, it depends on the class issues as well, too. So if you came from an African American school that was underfunded, when you were able to go to a predominantly white school that had a library that had all these neat things, you do see the benefits. You see the opportunities, the new chemistry sets, and all those things. But what's missing is sometimes you're just that one or two Black student and you're invisible, you're rendered invisible. You're actually seen, but not seen. It's odd, but they know who the two Black students are, or three, four, but you're not a part of the fabric. You're not a part of the homecoming court. You're not, the teachers don't see you as, they see other students who actually belong there. And you sense that sense of isolation sometimes. You sense invisibility. You sense that the school has no understanding or inkling of anything about your culture except maybe soul food day in February or something like that, as opposed to going to a school where the teachers had this idea that you were supposed to excel and you're going to get in trouble if you didn't. They thought you would excel, where you might transition to a school where they think you're at quote at risk and you're not going to excel. And they're so surprised to see that you're smart. And then you get this idea that you're the only smart Black person in the whole world, kind of thing. And then you go to a college and you realize, actually, that was my experience. I go to college, a historically Black college. I'm like, everybody's smart. Someone smarter than I can't. It was, you have internalized some of the stereotypes that it's just that's in the air, and you had to realize that there are tons of smart people that look like me. And so that's one of the downsides. It's a very ambivalent thing because you do get to meet people from different cultures you would not have an opportunity to meet, and that was life-changing. But it is a sense of isolation, a sense of always nothing relates to your own personal culture whatsoever, or nothing that you always are trying to fit in somebody else's box, kind of thing. And I think there are keys to changing that. They're simple by expanding the school's idea of culture, having different things to programs. I think they thought you just should be happy to come here. They don't change a thing. So I think that's one of the issues that was hard. I had some teachers that were cared about me that were white, and some did not see me at all. And so, but that, it depends on the teachers there. But you do see with African American schools that they're also, what you could see is they're so underfunded and they didn't have enough things, and you just didn't get to learn as many things because you didn't have the same stuff. So you did get more materials. So it's really a really ambiguous kind of thing. I know one of the things I decided to write my first book about teachers is because I would see the alumni of the students who went to the main historically Black university, high school in Nashville, Pearl Senior High School, and they were like 50s and 60s, and they loved their school. They knew every teacher, they knew everything. And it's like I barely remember anybody in my high school. Just wanted to get away from there. So I think that, and see the world, but I saw that and I said, what was it there? And I thought it was the teachers that built this bond, this connection with the community. And if you're being bused all the way across town to another community, that's not the community where your connection is being built. And so I think it might be different if you were an athlete or if you're really part of the school in another way, but you can draw a connection. But if you're just a student, it was difficult. It was a thing. And so that is why I decided to attend a historically Black university. So with his complications too, but I wanted to get a place where I knew I fit in, just without having to do anything to fit in. I could just fit in.
That feeling of fitting in, I think, is so powerful because I feel like the deepest learning only begins once you feel safe and once you feel like what you have to say mattered. And I think until you feel that, it's really hard to let anything that's being taught around you to even really penetrate you in that sense.
Yeah, I think they call it a culture of belonging now. I think that's a phrase they like to use now. So.
And so what are some of the things that you've seen that universities have tried to cultivate that?
Oh, I think a lot of things happen academically with the advent of the Africana Studies and Women's Studies programs. There are definitely safe spaces for students, safer spaces, I guess, for students to land who have not felt comfortable where they were. And so we have this idea of desegregation, but you also have students who have different sexual identities and gender identities who did not feel welcome in their schools. So, or maybe didn't feel safe in their schools. So now with college and these kind of courses you can academically, I think colleges have done a major progression of at least including courses about people of color, immigrants, different things in their curriculums, because the students are demanded to learn some of these things. I think they have so many support services for students now. I think also they still are struggling with how to address students and to help them get past some of the deficits they may have had coming from their high schools if they didn't get the actual things that they needed. And I think what's interesting, our university is reinstituting these summer programs they had done in the early, not this school, but schools had done in the early 1970s called remedial education to try to help students did attend underfunded schools with less resources to catch up, and it got knocked down when the conservative wave hit, and now it was put back in effect because of enrollment reasons. They want more students now. So that's interesting. I find, and as if they never done that before. I find that's interesting. Like they just renamed it Student Success System or something like that. But it really is a program to help students catch up, and they have found that with that help, they catch up and they do progress and fine. It's just that if you've not been exposed to certain things, your chemistry lab didn't have any this or that. Once you get an idea, you can catch up to it. So
Yeah.
you can catch up pretty good. So I think that's also to really push the different aspects of a university that students want to learn in different, whether it's humanities or social sciences or the hard sciences, to think about diversity in different ways, whether it's diversity by race, it could be gender or by nationality, to kind of have saved spaces for those students, affinity groups for those students, places where they can congregate and get to know each other. So I think those are colleges are really becoming in depth, because in larger sense, especially recent years, they want to increase their enrollment, and having students stay is the way you help them graduate. You get more. You don't want your students leaving because they felt isolated. So you want to make them feel safe. Also, helping students with their mental health issues is a big thing now. And some of that can be wrapped up into identities and, helping the students to do that with counseling. So colleges are really, I think, making a lot of strides in working to help students feel safer, feel at peace at their universities. They still have ways to go at some schools. And so then there's different colleges with different purposes. Some, I guess a religious school would have a certain area of what they would do, but other schools don't. So there's so many different types of universities students can go to now. They don't just have to go to an Ivy League school. I think the whole idea of you'll just have no career in life if you don't go to Ivy League school has been dissipated a bit. Those are great schools, but what you find is that there are teachers who have been attended those Ivy League schools teaching all over the country, schools all over the country. So you still kind of get the same educational experience of an Ivy League trained scholar, even at a state school like mine. So I think that's interesting. The cost of education as well. So
you said something earlier I wanted to touch back on, which is there was a conservative wave that took back funding from remedial education. Can you expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, it happens every now. In the 1980s, there was a conservative wave of backlash against affirmative action measures. The idea that white male students are losing out on education, which every statistic proves that's not true by the numbers. It was thought that they should cut these kind of programs out. These students can't go to college, then they shouldn't get, that's tough on them kind of thing. But some of those students were not African American, they were poor white students, so they kind of hurt themselves a bit. But they found that over the years now, with a little help, they can come back. So we need the students. Colleges need the students now. And some of that's population changes as well. If there's population drops, then there's going to be a pretty major population drop soon. So they're trying to keep the students. So it's not that much cost having students come in the summer for a few weeks, and then they can do well in their courses. So I think they're revisiting some of these things. Some of these things that affected colleges were not actually instituted by the colleges. It's just a larger political forces that want to have education look a certain way and shape a certain way, and they have a certain idea about what college is, and isn't quite the reality of the day kind of thing. Some of these people aren't actually educators anyway. So, but that's one of the things they're not. And we have to say, this is what actually students want, this is what students want. So, yes.
So would you say that there was another conservative wave in recent history as we struck down affirmative action? And
I think that's been an ongoing issue through the courts. I think of this very recent years, it's been a big wave, a big backlash. And I think because these programs are working very well in some cases, and it's kind of frightening to people, there's an idea of this whole idea of, if one person succeeds, the other one doesn't, instead of thinking maybe all of you can succeed. And that's a problem, unfortunately, that causes fear and distrust in people. But there's not really, there's kind of room for a lot of people to succeed, and they don't seem to understand that. Or the people that's succeeding is never hit at the niche of how many other people have succeeded, So I think that goes in there where they pick people of color against each other. Asians and blacks, Asians and Latinos, whites and blacks and Latinos, pick pit them against each other for resources when there's plenty of resources. They don't have to all fight for the small resource. Instead of fighting for that small resource, hey, why don't we have more resources for everybody? I think that's a thinking that it seems simple, but there's a problem when we don't do that because we just keep narrowly limiting ourselves to that one person and that one person and that one person and that one person. This is just my opinion of working with diversity stuff over the years, and I see that's a problem. And there's really power in solidarity, and we need to work for that. I think in some of the conservative ideas, we deal with social issues. They deal with gender and sexuality issues, not just race. But I think people who fear that the schooling of children will shape a different America than they want is a very real fear for them. But I don't think that fear is based on any facts. It's just a fear. But we have to not work through fear. And it's you have in a capitalist society different entities of people who are worried about that and economic issues as well. So that comes into factors. But I think I've always been a person who's looked at the people who were not in the top level of society, but within their communities they were. So that's a very interesting dichotomy for me because teachers were the elite of the African American communities, but they had their own issues with class, and then seeing how larger issues of class have dealt with things, and then also how universities have certain aspects, and even being a little older, some of those things have been viewed in my idea about how a teacher should look, how a teacher should act, how students should look and act, and what they should say. I have to find myself stopping that for a little and rethinking some of that. So we see that some of it's ingrained in us as we grow up in our childhood and our culture, but we need to get out and kind of expand things. And that's one of the great things by interacting with different people and learning different ideas, we're able to expand our minds a bit. So.
Yeah. So do you think at this current moment in time, do you feel that class or race plays a larger role in like limiting or creating an obstacle for academic achievement?
Well, I think class is underrated and not discussed, but it's a powerful factor. And whether you go to school or not, I've had students, an example, they're very good students, but they have to pay for their school, and college tuitions have really risen. I think the state schools are pretty reasonable, but the private schools are astronomical. So they get these jobs. They take out these exorbitant loans and they're in debt, but they get these jobs where they're working. I'm just using Amazon example, but where they really have to work. And in their minds, if they're especially a first generation college student, they don't understand that so much college is not in the classroom. You have to do work outside of the classroom, and a lot of it. And then they don't count for that. And they're overwhelmed and overburdened, and they can't keep up because some advisor didn't stop them from taking 6 classes and having 2 jobs. And they become so much anxiety, and it affects their mental health, and then they don't succeed. So I see that as a big problem of class issues that's really affecting colleges in a lot of ways. People are just trying to support themselves. Some people have their parents' support, but not everybody does. So, and they have to work, but it's very difficult to work your way through school now. And professors, we are still in a mentality where school should be your job, and they don't care if you have 2 jobs. You still should do your paper, and because there are standards, and there are standards we want to maintain. So that dichotomy is very complicated. And of course, externally, in a lot of places, racial prejudice, this whole idea of using terms and twisting them to mean other things like woke and DEI and CRT. It's a political tool. Unfortunately, Blacks are kind of caught in the catchphrase with that, but it's not just African Americans. It's going to be everybody that will catch that. Gender issues, trans, LGBT people and other people of color, immigrants. They're all going to catch that, unfortunately, but it's something we just have to fight against. And that's just some people using that for their own political gain, but we can't let that affect how we educate our students and how our colleges help people. So I think externally there are factors. Internally, there are factors in universities, of course, with the bureaucracy of universities and administration versus faculty kind of things, making faculty feel supported. The push for publish or perish is even more paramount now. And if you're going, and that's something you look forward to, even in a publishing industry that's really changing, where they don't have just gobs of book reviews for you to get, and little things like that. And so a lot of things that are other things that we even talk about, like technology, like AI in the classroom. How do we keep students from using that, having to use it the right way, the correct way to support them, and not to use it for like having to write their papers? It's a big issue. It's a big issue in the humanities. So adapting to technology in that way, and teachers don't know where to turn or what to do about that. They question that a third of their students are having AI write their papers, and we're saying that you really learn nothing that way. So you just learned how to use AI. So you can use AI to support you with research, but having them write your papers and having them understand that's not really what you should do is that's a big issue that we were talking
Yeah.
about. That's really looming large, because we're worried about how is that going to affect them when they apply to graduate schools? How is that going to affect them when they go work in business if they haven't learned basic writing tools? But on the other hand, AI is here. How can we use it to help them? So I think that's something we really are facing with teachers, especially teachers who are used to traditional social sciences and humanities writing courses on how to do things. But I think it's affecting all over, but it just seemed to rise all of a sudden. I think we weren't prepared for it. So I think that's a big issue, as big as anything right now. So
Yeah. So I think you said something that was really interesting that I want to touch on, which is the power of symbols. You touched on it earlier, which is that sometimes, let's say, for example, even words like feminism or even, critical race theory, sometimes somebody can take that symbol away from you, change what it means, and then all of a sudden you're no longer left with the symbol that you could have like aligned behind. And
yeah.
so, which is a really powerful way of kind of like suppressing any kind of rebellion or revolution very quickly. And so, what are some of the steps, and historically this has happened countless times, what are some of the ways in which you can kind of be very intentional about how a certain movement may be changing away from what it originally intended to be? And what are some things you can do to like see that?
I would think, well, I'll take CRT, for example. One thing you can see, that theory has been around since the 1980s,
Mm,
1990s. It was not new at all, but it was used as a way of looking at all that's bad with education and teaching race instead of what you should learn, like math and science or things. But it's a legal strategy. It's a legal theory. I didn't learn to graduate school, but history, you kind of see these theories and just think of them already. But I think one way of countering that is asking the student or asking the person, what do you think this means? And you can try to
yeah.
explain it that way, asking them, because sometimes they don't know what it means. It's just fear. It's just, ooh, it's just a fearful thing. And some of that, I've always taught the tenets of it without having the theory behind it. And because it's just kind of common sense reality, what it is. And that's a lot of history there. And so just thinking about that, well, would you say don't you think there's racism in this country? And I don't know if they say no, I don't know what you would go with that, but you can pretty much find evidence of that. That's pretty prevalent in our laws, our systems, our every aspect of every American society almost. So you can do that. But then once we know these things, who have been the people that have tried to mitigate that? How have we tried to change that? How have we worked to bring these people together and to look at that? And I try to bring in examples of people who, like Bree Newsom was a woman who climbed this pole in Charleston when there was a recent bombing of a church. I mean, not a bombing, a shooting at a church there. And they were fighting over the Confederate flag, trying to have it brought down. And she climbs a pole and tries to bring down the flag herself. And the police were going to shock the pole with electricity to try to get her off the pole. And this white man grabs and holds the pole. And they're like, we can't shock her if you're going to be get off the pole. He said, no, I'm not going to let you shock this woman. And that's being an ally more than just saying, I'm downright support you. I have a t-shirt. Then that's when you really risk yourself, risk your cause, your own personhood to help somebody else. So I talk about the ways because people often ask how they can help. And that's an extreme case, but going beyond just like, I support you, speaking up, standing with the person, help letting them listening to them is one thing. So you can work on that. I think we were making strides and we kind of pushed back, but the people making the strides are still there. They didn't go anywhere. So we just have to work with
Mm,
that. We have to be more vocal about being standing up for things. Sometimes we're just so shocked. Did they say that? is that what they're, oh my God. And we just kind of cower, but we have to be vocal and say, I don't support that. We don't believe they don't have that in this classroom. In my classroom, I give a little bit of speech that this is a civil environment. We have civil discourse. You have the freedom to express your ideas, but you don't have the freedom to attack people or violate their personhood or try to hurt people anyway. You have the freedom to differ in opinions, but you must base them on evidence. It's not just something you heard on a, on some kind of radio station. You have to have evidence in history. You have to back it up. And so if you can back it up, I will listen to it. So we won't have a lot of foolishness. So I just kind of set a tone because I think our ability to have kind of disagree about things in a civil way is being chipped at. And we don't want to ever lose that because that's how ideas grow out of that, out of that environment. When people are free to say what they want and disagree in a supportive environment, but not attack other people, so.
Yeah. I mean, so connecting back to the concept of CRT, which I think has gone into, I would love to do a season just on that because I think it's been politicized and it's gone completely out of what it originally was. Can you explain a little bit about what the theory of CRT is?
Sure, and this is just my perspective. I'm not the legal, Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar or anything,
Yeah.
but basically CRT is understanding what she was, as a legal scholar, was trying to understand why there were so many deficits and so many people going to jail, even though you had the civil rights movement and all these changes. And what she looks at is the idea of systemic racism, racism embedded in systems of power, like the healthcare system, the judicial system, the school systems. They are embedded in policies, they're embedded in practice. And to look at that, the way to really remedy racism is to dismantle those policies in those systems. And so, and that's systemic racism. And I think people were so upset about that. It doesn't mean that that you can't stop racism, but it is embedded within systems. It's not just one person. It's not just one person calling another person a name. That's bad, but it's embedded in a system where you are not getting the right same equal privileges or equity because of your race or your gender. So it's systemic racism. It's the idea that of dismantling those systems. And that's a little scary to people because they benefited from these systems, even if they per se would not say that they're a racist or anything like that. So some of the housing policies you have per se, even some of the policies in labor that we work and say. So I think that kind of scares people. But the way of looking at that is looking at a policy or an issue dealing with a person and look at the systemic racism surrounding that and see how they adapted to that. Maybe that affected their situation. It doesn't mitigate where they committed a crime or not, but we understand that we might be able to get resources to help them to try to stop the situation from happening. And so I think just a little thing in my university, when people would apply for jobs, they really would toss, and in some cases, I can't say everyone, just make it a disclaimer, but people who attended a small historically Black university was not going to get the same attention as someone who attended and worked at another prior, maybe Ivy League institution, even though they may have gone to similar schools. And so that was not fair, really. I mean, that's just where they worked. It's not where they went to school, but even if it did, you see the systemic perceptions. And if you blend that, intersect that with class, and intersect that with other xenophobia, maybe, or intersect that with other things, in gender issues, you really have a problem, right? So they all intersect in a way. So there's systemic sexism too, right? So, and other things. So I think looking at those systems and thinking about dismantling is really the crux of critical race theories. The other ideas that if you gain knowledge, you should support your communities. Just keep it for yourself. That's another aspect of critical race theory. I think another aspect is looking at when there has been major strides and changes and really sensing that those changes and strides were done because it benefited the larger society as well. So, and so it wasn't antithesis to this. So like a desegregation, when whites move out to the suburbs, those suburbs really grew and benefited and got more tax dollars, and they did so well because of that. So they benefit from some of the things that we're pushing through. It really goes through because they benefited from it too. That's the one way that happened. Even the whole idea of diversity, we need these people to help the bottom line. It will help schools work, they'll help schools, they'll learn more. It's really benefiting other people. So some
Yeah.
of CRT is a little harsh, but it reflects the reality kind of things. But it doesn't negate that people have hope. It doesn't negate that people don't think they can overcome these things. It's just really giving you an idea of what you have to overcome. So it's not like, why didn't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? You didn't have boots. So you didn't have any boots. So,
So is CRT a theory that like presents a certain amount of like themes that should be covered, or what is it exactly? It's
it's
a
usually applied to a situation. So it's originally a legal theory, but education scholars start to use it to look at systemic inequities in education and school funding, etc. It used to be, I saw it being applied to kind of something you put in your term paper to try to explain things. And it's really a broad, diffuse idea theory that can be applied to any inequity. So you can look at healthcare disparities and look at systemic racism and that, and you would apply critical race theory. So it's not to be taught, and it's a legal theory. It's not to be taught in the public schools at all, really. It never was. What was taught was anti-Blackness training, but it's CRT, and they mixed those up, kind of thing. There was just they mixed them up. But the CRT is a complicated legal theory, and it's based on it's not based for the lower grades to think about, unless you want to really pare it down, but looking at different people, but and things. But to teaching people that there's systems of oppression that are in this country is the reality, unfortunately. So we're still working on to dismantle them. Or even some scholars say decolonialize, I can't talk today, some of these issues, right? And
yeah.
so I think some people adapt to these issues and they think it's the norm, but the norm is not quite fair, right? So it's just breaking down some of these issues to look at them. So
Yeah. Well, my last question for you will be, in your long history and in long, career, what would you say, if you could give one tidbit, a nugget of wisdom, what would it be about how you lead your own life, I guess?
well, how I
Out.
live my life, and in some from my research, my recent book was on a woman who just recently passed away, Bertha Maxwell Roddy. She's educational wonderkin because what she did was push through African American studies. She's doing these very complicated things, but what she does is call people in instead of calling them out. So if they didn't understand what Black studies was, she explained it to them. Where they would learn that they become her ally instead of her enemy, and that didn't always work, but she never felt like I have to just miss you just because of who you are. And she had benefactors from Jewish daughters of daughters of railroad textile magnates, and she had CEOs and then housekeepers who were all supporters of her program. I think one thing is thinking about not to assume people at a certain class they are or educational credentials. They may be Ivy League, but they may be really not bright. So you need to look at the person for who they are, what they contribute, what they can share with you. I think it's everyone can learn, but also I think I value education. I really wish that other students, I think it's a trend in this country not to value education, but I think education has been, for myself and my family, a way that we were able to enter the middle class. It changed our lives dramatically. My grandmother was born in 1900, and she didn't have access to school except for 6 weeks out of the year. And she raised two children that went to college, and they raised children. So she was able to reshape her whole family's trajectory, my mom. So I think education is still an amazing equalizer that can help students really change. And I think the whole attitude about what's to do with a college degree, you can do so many things with a college degree. You still can. It's still worth it to go to college. And the people who are saying that they have gone to college, so they may be just telling you something. So don't let people think that college isn't important. Don't think people think that education isn't paramount just for the learning content, but also a great college. When you enter it, it can reshape your whole life. You come in a different person. You've educated what's called the life of the mind. It's been awakened. So you think differently about these things, and we need that. And I think out of our great movements, some have moved from college students, and we might have to have other movements emerge from college students for even if they just want to quote, get a good job. it's still a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn, and not everybody has that opportunity. Other places they're gender blocked, or they can't because they don't have the money to go to college or learn things. So I think that we need to make college more accessible to students. I think we need to help maybe reduce. Hope I'm glad they're reducing some of the college debt for students, but I do think it's still a place where it's a great equalizer. You can get a good college education and do kind of, it will propel you to really higher things in life if you want to. So I really believe in that. So I'm still selling people on college because even though unless you're a great artist, but not everybody can be an athlete or artist. Some people need to be educators. So we need to teach the people. I think it's still a great career. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing all your insight. Really appreciate it. And this was a lovely conversation.
Oh, thank you. I don't think too way out, but I talk a lot. But I'll see how it turns out. It'll be interesting to hear it. So yes.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.